My name is Kristin Pak in the U.S., but my Korean name is Incheon. And I was born in 1976 the first record of me is from the Donggu-gucheong in Incheon. I was adopted around 7 months old. I grew up in Waterbury, Connecticut, which is about 70 miles northeast of New York City. It was a working class, very mixed community, and I lived there for 18 years. So in the same house, we never moved, which was great. So growing up, I always had the same neighborhood and friends, and it was very stable in that way. My neighborhood was so diverse. Like if I walked just from my house to my school bus stop, I would hear around 10 different languages being spoken. But that meant, the diversity meant that race and ethnicity was always front and center. There was a lot of conflict in our city. It was one of the cities that had busing to integrate the schools. So it was always very much part of our lives as far as being Korean. Even though there were not that many Koreans, we had a Korean supermarket. A lot of people I know who were adopted were not in this kind of situation. It's a little bit uncommon, I think. I always knew I was Korean, but I didn't know what that meant exactly because I didn't actually visit Korea until I was like 22 years old, 23, something like that. I don't remember. And it's hard to claim something if you don't have a clear idea of what that is. Because so many of my friends would spend summers abroad, going to Albania, going to Portugal, Puerto Rico. I didn't have that. So that lack of clear identity was really noticeable because almost no one actually just identified as just American. Everyone's like, I'm not American, I'm Portuguese. So that was something I couldn't say. When I moved to New York, as far as interacting with the Korean American family and how much a part of it I felt or didn't, I realized by meeting so many people in New York City who were Korean Americans, second generation, there are many different ways to be Korean American. Some of my friends spoke Korean fluently and grew up going to church 3 times a week in the Korean church, and some of them also did not speak Korean well, the only other Koreans they knew were in their family and interacted with their non-Korean relatives in communities. So I think I'm just part of that continuum. After coming back from Korea, I felt like I could kind of join the people I grew up with who also had very strong ethnic identities and knew what people were talking about when they said, oh, my country, things like that. So that was nice to be able to say, when they were talking about their trips, I could say, oh yeah, when I was in Korea, I did this. And it was a way to actually not only connect with other Koreans, but other first, second generation. As someone who grew up without a Korean family, and talking to my friends, we were joking that I wasn't 1.5, and I couldn't be second generation because I was born here, right? So there's like, oh, 1.XXX or 1.9999 or with the 9 with the bar over it or something like that. I was teaching English as a second language to adult immigrants in New York City. The anti-immigrant sentiment was really ramping up, and that affected the funding, especially at the federal level. And we were downsizing. I had just become the assistant director of my program and had to lay off half of my staff. And I decided to come to Korea because I knew I could get a job here. So I got a job teaching English at a university down in Daejeon. I was trying to decide between Mexico, Brazil, or Korea, but I knew I would have a lot more privileges here, and the infrastructure to get set up was much easier. And I knew people living here already, and all the Brazilians and Mexicans I knew were living in New York City. But I don't speak Korean. I speak Portuguese and Spanish, but I don't speak Korean. Language is very important to me as a linguist, as a teacher of languages, of course, and I think anyone who moves from one society where one language is dominant and then a different one, especially if you don't speak one of those, you think about it a lot. And I think I'm in the far minority where I do not believe that language and culture are inseparable. I don't think that you need to speak Korean to be fully Korean. I don't think that national identity is something that could be quantified, but I do think it makes it easier in some cases to access most things. It's never a handicap to know more languages, right? But I don't think it's so essential. So I don't know if Seoul has become home yet, but I feel like my neighborhood is my neighborhood. I recognize people there. I think some people recognize me, or at least my dog. And I don't think my identity has changed a lot. I've always considered myself to be Korean American. Obviously, some details have changed as I got older, as I moved from city to city. I definitely consider myself to be Korean American. From about 2016 to 2020, we might not have been so happy to be American, but it's something you still can't deny. But I never really thought that I should be considered a foreigner in Korea, but I've gotten a little more vocal about it. In 2018, I reclaimed my Korean citizenship. I live in Korea. I assume both of my parents are Korean. Yeah, there's no reason to... You can't be a foreigner in a country you're born in, that your parents were born in, and that you hold the citizenship of. I would like other people who are adopted from Korea to also strongly identify as part of the Korean nation, especially those who live here in Korea, because if we're asking for recognition or rights or services from the Korean government, we deserve it just as much as any other Korean person. It comes up a lot with people who live here, but also when we're talking about the people who are adopted overseas from Korea who did not get citizenship of their adoptive countries. That means they are Korean citizens, and the South Korean government has an obligation to take care of their citizens overseas. If what you want is to stay in the country, then the ambassador of South Korea has an obligation to represent you. So that's one of the things I think that is really important. As far as Americans in Korea go, I think we should also try to understand the relationship between the United States and South Korea. Today is April 3rd. The almost 75th, not quite 75th anniversary of the Jeju Uprising. And the United States was complicit in that massacre. And the very unequal relationship between South Korea and the U.S. I think we also, and why people left South Korea was not necessarily a choice. And I think all of that needs to be spoken out about more. People say it was a choice to go to the U.S. I had no choice to go to the U.S. I didn't become American by choice. And people who are not adopted often didn't have a choice either. I know people who were kind of fleeing the dictators or who would have, been in pretty dire circumstances had they stayed. So that's not a choice to leave. I teach in the beauty arts department. So I teach undergraduates their obligatory English courses. I hope that I can change a student's idea of who is a native English speaker. I'm sure you've seen the advertisements asking for native English speakers. Kyopo's okay. As if those are two separate things. Or F4s are okay. An F4 visa for overseas Koreans could be up to 3 generations back. I think by that point you might be considered a native speaker, right? So I hope they understand, like anyone, and a native speaker of English does not mean, in my case it does, it doesn't mean, but in other cases it doesn't mean you don't speak Korean. the students might have to understand that it's not either or, an either or situation. Being Korean American, being Korean can mean so many different things. The experiences are so much more, are so much fuller than were portrayed in media and even sometimes our own self-perceptions.